My name is Thomas, and the night my own daughter told me to shut up at her dinner table was the night everything I thought I had built as a father collapsed. Imagine giving your life, your sweat, your health to raise a child, only to be silenced in front of the very family you created. I didn't shout back. I didn't beg. Instead, I picked up my keys, stood tall, and walked out knowing they had no idea what was about to come. What followed wasn't rage, but a quiet storm of decisions that would change their lives forever. Before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear even more stories like this one. Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares. Those 5 words came down like a hammer in the middle of the dinner table. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, the clatter of plates and the murmur of laughter around me suddenly swallowed by silence. For a moment I thought I had misheard her, but the sharpness in her voice left no room for doubt. My daughter, the very child I had once carried on my shoulders, had silenced me in front of her family, as if I were nothing more than background noise. I had opened my mouth to share a story about her late mother, a memory that still gave me warmth on cold nights. I wanted her children to know the woman whose love had kept me alive through years of hardship. But before I could finish the first sentence, my daughter's words cut me off. And then, as if to drive the knife deeper, her husband chuckled, lifting his glass to hide his smirk. That laugh burned more than her insult. It wasn't just dismissal, it was entertainment at my expense. The grandchildren sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes glued to their plates. The oldest fiddled with his water glass, pretending not to notice. The youngest shifted uncomfortably, cheeks red, not from shame of me, but from fear of his mother's tone. I could see it in their small faces. They wanted to defend me, but they didn't dare. Children learn quickly which voices to follow, and mine had just been declared worthless. Inside my chest felt hollow. I wanted to speak to remind them all of the years I had given. I wanted to rise and say, "This table stands because of me. Those walls around you, the roof above you, I helped make them yours." But I stayed quiet. My pride would not allow me to beg for dignity in a house I had already built with my own sweat. Instead, I placed my fork down, gently folded my napkin in my lap, and lowered my eyes. Outwardly, I looked calm, almost indifferent. But beneath the surface, memories clawed their way into my mind. Nights of working double shifts so she could wear a new dress to school. Days when I skipped meals so she wouldn't go hungry. Years of putting her happiness before my comfort. And yet here I sat, being told to shut up like some intruder who had overstayed his welcome. The room moved on without me. Plates were passed, conversations picked back up, laughter returned as though nothing had happened. But I sat there as if behind glass, unseen, unheard, erased. It was not just an insult. It was a revelation. I was no longer father or grandfather. I was a burden. That night, something broke inside me. Not loudly, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that life as I had known it was over. And though my lips stayed sealed, my silence was not weakness. It was the first step toward reclaiming the dignity they thought they had stripped away. As I sat there, my eyes lowered to the untouched plate in front of me, my mind traveled back through the years. Every sacrifice, every ache, every quiet compromise came flooding in, and each one now felt like a stone pressing against my chest. I had lived my life with one promise carved into my soul: my daughter would never know the hunger, the cold, or the smallness that had marked my own childhood. And I kept that promise, no matter the cost. I remembered nights working construction until my hands were too raw to grip a hammer, then dragging myself to a garage shift where I fixed machines under a flickering bulb. I told myself that if my body broke, at least my daughter's future would stand strong. I remembered weekends hauling bricks for men half my age, sweat pouring down my back, while I thought of her smile as she walked into school with shoes I could barely afford. Those weren't just memories, they were the currency of my devotion, and I paid in full. When she was little, I skipped meals so she could eat. I would sip tea while she slept soundly, her belly full, my stomach empty. I smiled through the hunger, because that's what fathers did. I sold my old car, the one I dreamed of fixing up for retirement, so she could go to college. I took out loans in my name, wore my exhaustion like a second skin, and stood weeping in the crowd the day she walked across the stage with her diploma in hand. That moment I thought was worth every blister, every unpaid dream. I believed she would carry that day as proof of my love. When she married, I poured my savings into her wedding. Every flower, every rented chair, every smile in the photographs was paid for with the years I had put away for myself. And when she and her husband wanted a home, I co-signed the papers, placed the deposit, and made sure they never began their life in debt. Every corner of that house bore my fingerprints, invisible but real, the porch light that welcomed them home, the paint that brightened their walls, the garden I helped plant. I thought it was a house that tied us together. I thought it would always have a place for me. But sitting at her table that night, being told to shut up, I realized none of it mattered. The calluses on my hands, the meals I skipped, the years I shaved off my health, all of it had been forgotten, swallowed by convenience and entitlement. She did not see the man who built her foundation. She saw only an old man cluttering her life. The laughter around me grew louder, as though my silence gave them permission to forget I was even there. For decades I had carried the weight of sacrifice, believing it bought me love, respect, and belonging. But in that moment I understood the truth. Sacrifice does not guarantee gratitude, and sometimes the very people you bleed for are the ones who tell you your voice no longer matters. What stung most that night wasn't only my daughter's sharp tongue. It was the way her children, my grandchildren, began to follow her lead. Children notice everything. They notice tones, glances, sighs. And when a mother rolls her eyes or cuts her father short, little ones learn what's acceptable. At first it was subtle, easy to dismiss, but once you've been humiliated, every detail cuts deeper. I saw the way the oldest boy glanced at his mother before answering me, as if to ask her permission. I noticed the way the youngest girl stifled a laugh when I stumbled, trying to recall a date from my past. They weren't cruel by nature. They were being trained quietly, without words, to treat me as unnecessary. My daughter might have spoken the insult, but the echoes were taking root in her children's hearts. Once those same children used to rush to greet me at the door, their little arms wrapped around my legs, their voices shouting, "Grandpa's here." I used to bring them puzzles, books, even candy their mother disapproved of, because I wanted them to associate my presence with joy. I told them stories about their grandmother, their heritage, about the small battles of life that shaped who we were. I thought I was giving them treasure, history, identity, pride. But lately when I began a story, I'd see their small shoulders slump. They'd giggle among themselves sometimes, glancing at their mother before rolling their eyes. They were learning that Grandpa's words were nothing but clutter in the air. I can still remember one night I brought a photo album filled with moments from their mother's childhood, birthdays, family vacations, her first day of school. I thought they would marvel at the pictures, ask questions, connect the dots of where they came from. Instead, my daughter sighed and pushed the album aside, muttering, "Dad, we don't need old pictures lying around." The children followed her cue, and the album sat unopened, its memories dismissed as junk. It broke something in me. Those pictures weren't clutter, they were proof of life, proof of love, proof of sacrifice. Yet in their eyes, shaped by her contempt, I was just an old man who repeated himself, a relic taking up space at their table. Sitting there that evening, I realized it wasn't only about me. If they learned to disregard me, they would one day disregard others who came before them. They would grow up thinking legacy, respect, and memory were disposable. And the thought chilled me to the bone. The meal continued, and though no one raised their voice again, I felt myself shrinking smaller with each passing moment. My grandchildren's glances mirrored their mother's tone, and I understood something painful. My voice wasn't just silenced, it was being erased from the next generation. That was when I knew the insult wasn't a single wound. It was a pattern spreading from mother to child, turning respect into mockery. And I could no longer pretend it would fade with time. I'll never forget the evening I carried that photo album into her house. It wasn't heavy in weight, but it carried decades of my life between its pages. My wife's smile, my daughter's first day at school, family trips we could barely afford, but made magical with laughter. I placed it carefully on the dining table after dinner, proud to share it. I thought it would be a bridge between generations, something the children could flip through and see where they came from. But the moment my daughter's eyes landed on it, she sighed as if I had dropped a bag of trash on her polished table. "Dad, we don't need old pictures lying around. Please don't clutter the house with this." Her words were casual, dismissive, but to me, they were devastating. That album wasn't clutter, it was my life, her life, the fabric of our family's story. The children looked at her, then at me, and followed her lead. They pushed their chairs back, eager to escape, leaving the album untouched. I sat there staring at it, the silence in the room thicker than any insult. I wanted to open the pages to point out her little hands gripping a jump rope, the way her mother's eyes glowed as she held her. I wanted to tell them the stories behind those frozen smiles, but I couldn't. Not when the message had already been sent. My memories didn't matter. The worst came later, when her husband began to show his true colors. In the beginning, he had always been polite, respectful even. He called me sir, helped carry groceries, thanked me when I offered help. But as the years passed, I noticed the smirks he tried to hide whenever I stumbled in conversation or repeated myself. That night, as I struggled to recall the name of an old friend, he chuckled under his breath and muttered, "Losing it, huh?" My daughter laughed lightly beside him, and together they turned my fading memory into their private joke. I pretended not to hear. I forced a smile, nodded, and tried to continue, but inside I was unraveling. My mind screamed to remind them of the nights I sat by her bedside when she was sick as a child, praying feverishly for her recovery. Of the mornings I walked miles to work so she could ride the bus to school. Of the tears of pride I shed when I walked her down the aisle. But I stayed silent, because I knew if I spoke my voice would crack, and they would dismiss my pain as the tantrum of an old man. Silence had become my shield, but also my prison. Every time they laughed, every time they brushed aside my past, I retreated further into myself. And I began to see the truth more clearly than ever. My stories, my memories, my very presence had become a nuisance in the home I once believed was built on love. That night, staring at the untouched photo album, I understood something final. My place in their lives was shrinking into nothing, and if I didn't act soon, there would be no trace of me left at all. By the time the plates were cleared that night, I felt like a ghost among the living. Conversations had flowed around me as though I were no longer part of the family at all. My daughter's sharp words still rang in my ears, echoing louder than any laughter that followed. Her husband leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied, as if my humiliation had been the evening's entertainment. The children, too, avoided my eyes, their little hands busying themselves with spoons and cups to escape the tension. I sat there quietly, folding my napkin with trembling hands, and thought of my wife. If she had been alive, she would have silenced our daughter's insult before it ever left her lips. She would have reminded her that a father's voice deserves respect, that the stories of the past are not clutter, but inheritance. The thought of her absence cut deeper than the insult itself, because I realized how alone I truly was in that room. When the meal ended, I pushed my chair back slowly. I didn't slam. It didn't demand an apology, didn't raise my voice. I simply stood careful to keep my back straight, my face calm. I reached for my coat draped over the back of the chair, and as I slid my arms into the sleeves, my hand brushed against something in the pocket, my old car keys. I had slipped them in absent-mindedly earlier, but now as the metal pressed into my palm, I felt their weight differently. They were more than keys to an engine. They were a reminder that not everything in this family belonged to my daughter. Some things, important things, were still mine. I walked to the door without hurry, without a word, and no one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. No one even looked up. To them, I was simply leaving like a shadow disappearing down the hall. But in my silence, I was already making a decision. This would be the last time I sat at their table. The last time I allowed myself to be treated as an inconvenience. The last time my voice was smothered under the weight of disrespect. Outside, the night air was cool against my face, and I breathed it in like medicine. The sound of the door closing behind me was not just the end of a meal, it was the end of a season. I gripped the keys in my pocket tighter, the small jingle sounding like a bell of resolve. My humiliation had cut me deeply, but it had also sharpened something inside me. I would not lash out in anger. I would not raise my voice to demand respect. My answer would be quieter, steadier, more final than words could ever be. As I walked to my car, I realized that silence when chosen can be more powerful than any speech. That night, I chose silence. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man preparing to reclaim his dignity. The morning after that dinner, I woke to the sound of silence. Not the kind that weighed on me like humiliation, but a silence that felt sharper, more focused. I sat at my small kitchen table, the sunlight spilling across the worn wood, and spread out a stack of folders I hadn't touched in years. Deeds, bank statements, loan papers, all the documents that told the real story of who held what in this family. As I flipped through each page, a realization settled over me. My daughter's world was still tied to my name. The car she drove every day wasn't hers. It was mine, bought and registered under my account. The house she lived in, the one she decorated as if it already belonged to her, had my signature on the mortgage. Even the family fund she and her husband dipped into whenever expenses piled up came from my pension and savings. All those years, I had assumed that generosity meant security. I thought by giving I was building love, respect, and loyalty. But now I saw the truth. I had built comfort for them, not connection. And that comfort rested squarely on me. Without my signature, without my quiet contributions, their life would crumble like a house of cards. I held the keys I had slipped into my pocket the night before, turning them over in my palm. They weren't just for a car. They were a symbol, a reminder that I wasn't as powerless as she believed. She might silence me at her table, but the roof over her head, the car in her driveway, the bills she paid with my help, all of it still bore my name. For years, I had mistaken silence for weakness. I endured her eye rolls, her cutting tone, her husband's smirks, because I told myself family meant forgiveness. But sitting there with the papers spread before me, I understood something new. Silence could also be a weapon if used with patience. She thought I was an old man fading into irrelevance. She forgot that her comfort was built on the foundation of my labor. And so a thought struck me. What if I simply stopped? What if I took back what was mine quietly, without shouting, without warning? She believed my silence meant surrender. But what if my silence became her undoing, I closed the folders, stacked them neatly, and slid them back into the drawer. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't trembling. Instead, I felt calm, steady, almost at peace. The humiliation I had suffered at her table had lit a fire in me, but it wasn't the fire of rage, it was the fire of clarity. For the first time in years, I could see clearly who I was, not a burden, not an afterthought, but the patriarch who still held the strings. The first spark of revenge had been struck not with words, but with paper ink and the quiet power of ownership. And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't waste another breath begging for respect. I would let my silence speak louder than her insult ever could. For most of my life, I believed silence was the safer road. When my back ached from double shifts, I never complained. When my wife passed away too soon, I bore the grief quietly so my daughter could feel steadiness instead of despair. And when she began dismissing me with sighs and eye rolls, I told myself she was just tired, that it was better to swallow the sting than to create conflict. I thought silence meant strength, but over the years, my silence had been twisted into something else: weakness. That night at her dinner table proved it. She didn't tell me to shut up because she was stressed. She said it because in her mind, my voice carried no weight anymore. And why wouldn't she believe that I had spent years letting small cuts slide, convincing myself they didn't matter? But little cuts add up. Eventually, they bleed a man dry. Sitting in my kitchen with those papers in front of me, I realized I had been wrong about silence. It isn't always noble. Sometimes silence is surrender, a slow retreat that leaves you hollow. But in the right moment, silence can also be sharper than any words. It can be a blade, a boundary, a message stronger than shouting. I thought of how often I had endured. The birthday dinners where my stories were brushed aside with "we've heard this already." The times my advice about the children was swatted away with "we know how to raise our kids." The countless times my memories of their grandmother were cut short, like they were nothing but static. Each time I bit my tongue, believing I was keeping the peace. But all I was really doing was teaching them that my presence didn't matter. Not anymore. The daughter who once clung to my leg when thunderstorms rattled the windows now silenced me in front of her children. The man she married, whose debts I helped shoulder, now smirked when I stumbled on a name. They thought I had nothing left to give but silence. And maybe that was true, but silence on my terms. That morning, I felt a shift. My silence would no longer be the silence of humiliation. It would be the silence of action. No arguments, no begging for respect. Only decisions carried out without fanfare, without warning. The kind of silence that leaves its mark not in words, but in consequences. I pressed the stack of papers flat with my palm, feeling the weight of them steady me. My name was still there on deeds, on accounts, on signatures. My silence hadn't erased my role. It had preserved it, waiting for this very moment. She thought she had reduced me to an old man with fading stories, but she had forgotten that my silence had kept this family alive for decades. And now that same silence would remind her who I truly was. That was the lesson I had finally learned. Silence can cut deeper than any insult if you choose when to let it speak. The decision didn't come in a burst of rage. It arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping through the door. I stood in my bedroom that evening, staring at the old wooden dresser, and realized I had no desire to keep pretending. Pretending that dinners with my daughter still meant belonging. Pretending that her sighs and sharp words were just stress. Pretending that I still had a place at her table. The truth was plain. Now I had been dismissed, and no apology would ever stitch that wound closed. I opened the closet slowly, the smell of cedar and dust greeting me. Hanging there was my warm coat, the one I had worn through winters of labor, its seams frayed, but still holding strong. Beside it, a few shirts, neatly folded trousers, nothing fancy. I reached up to the shelf and pulled down a small suitcase faded with a stubborn zipper, the kind you take when you don't plan on staying long. Yet as I placed it on the bed, I knew this would not be a temporary escape. This was the beginning of something final. I began folding clothes methodically. 2 shirts, a pair of trousers, socks, rolled tight a sweater for the cold mornings. I packed the coat, last laying it across the top, as though I were tucking in an old friend. Then I reached for the nightstand and lifted the photo of my wife. Her smile, captured in a moment long gone, steadied me. I wrapped the frame carefully in a scarf and placed it at the center of the suitcase. She was coming with me not in flesh, but in memory, in spirit, in the strength she had always given me. Next came the folder of papers I had reviewed earlier that day. Deeds, accounts, titles, every proof that I still had control over the life my daughter believed was hers. I slid them into the suitcase, their weight heavier than any clothes. They weren't just documents. They were the keys to my dignity, the quiet reminder that I was not leaving empty-handed. I didn't pack much else. I didn't need much. For the first time in decades, I was packing only for myself, not for a family trip, not for someone else's comfort, just me. The act felt strange, liberating, and heartbreaking all at once. I thought about the house, about how my daughter assumed it would be hers one day, about how she had already decorated it like she owned it. But it was mine still, and soon she would learn that truth in a way she could not ignore. As the suitcase snapped shut, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle around me. It wasn't the silence of humiliation anymore. It was the silence of resolve. The decision was made. I would leave not with anger, not with shouting, but with the quiet finality of a man who had had enough. And as I reached into my pocket and felt the jingle of my old car keys, I knew this small suitcase carried more than clothes. It carried the first step toward reclaiming my life. The suitcase sat by the door like a silent witness to my decision. I didn't slam it down or rush. I moved carefully, deliberately, because for the first time in years, I felt steady. That steadiness carried me to the small kitchen phone, its cord still curled from years of use. I dialed a number I hadn't used in months, but knew by heart the number of my lawyer. He had been with me through much of my working life. He handled the sale of my first property, the setting up of accounts, the small nest egg I had built one long shift at a time. His voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of voice that never flinched, even when lives were changing. "It's been a while," he said. I told him it had, and then I told him exactly what I needed. I wanted my daughter's name removed from my will. I wanted her cut off from every account, every deed, every asset she had come to believe was already hers. I wanted the house she treated as her own prepared for sale. I wanted every legal tie between us severed quietly, efficiently, permanently. There was a pause. He asked only one question. "Are you sure?" "Yes." I answered, my voice firm. "I've never been more certain." From that moment, wheels began to turn. Papers were drawn, signatures scheduled, authorizations prepared. He promised discretion, and I knew he meant it. He had always been a man who valued silence as much as I did now. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen. The decision wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no grand speeches, no witnesses. Just a man, a phone call, and the shifting of a legacy. And yet that quiet felt louder than any argument I had ever had. I thought about my daughter's face when she realized what I had done. How she would first brush it off as a mistake. How panic would creep in when the bank confirmed the changes. How desperation would rise when the property papers arrived at her doorstep. She would call, she would demand, she would rage, and through it all, I would remain silent, because silence was now my answer. I walked back to the suitcase and slipped the photo of my wife out from inside. I placed it on the mantel, her familiar smile meeting mine. "I'm doing this for us," I whispered. "For the years we sacrificed, for the respect we earned, for the love that should never have been dismissed." As the evening fell and the house grew dark, I felt lighter than I had in years. My humiliation at that dinner table had not destroyed me. It had delivered me here to this moment of clarity, of power, of justice. And with a single phone call, I had begun rewriting the story my daughter thought she controlled. In the days that followed, my silence began to take on a new weight. For years, it had been the silence of endurance, the kind that swallows pain so the family doesn't see the cracks. But now it was different. Every time the phone rang, and I didn't answer, every form I signed with steady hands, every line of her name, being erased from what once tied us together, that silence grew sharper, more purposeful. I kept to myself in that small hotel room where I had checked in after leaving. The walls smelled faintly of dust and old paint, but to me it was freedom. Each morning, I'd rise, brew the bitter hotel coffee, and spread the documents across the desk. Deeds transferring accounts, sealed signatures, shifting the balance of power with the quiet scrape of a pen. My daughter had mocked me as though my voice no longer mattered. She had no idea that my pen was louder than her insult could ever be. She thought she had silenced me at her table. In truth, she had only awakened something I had buried for too long. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to demand respect. Respect cannot be begged, it must be given. And when it is denied, the only answer is to remove yourself from the table altogether. That was exactly what I was doing. I imagined her face when the truth reached her. The phone calls would start annoyed, grow panicked, and finally tremble with desperation. She would realize the safety net she assumed would always be there had vanished. Her husband, so quick to smirk, would rage at me through voicemails, but it wouldn't matter. They would learn the lesson that words couldn't teach. Every insult has a cost. And yet I wasn't acting out of cruelty. I wasn't trying to hurt them for the sake of pain. My goal wasn't vengeance in the way people imagine it, loud, fiery, destructive. Mine was quieter, steadier, rooted in dignity. What I wanted was balance. If she could strip me of my place in her family with a sentence, then I had every right to strip her of the inheritance she believed was already hers. One evening, I sat by the window, the glow of the neon hotel sign flickering against the glass, and I realized how calm I felt. No shouting, no anger coursing through my veins. Just calm. My silence had grown teeth, and it was doing the work words never could. It was cutting her out of the future she thought she controlled. I picked up the photo of my wife from the nightstand, ran my fingers over the frame, and whispered, "I finally found my voice again. And it's not in words, it's in what I've taken back." That night, for the first time in years, I slept without heaviness in my chest. My silence was no longer humiliation, it was justice. And I knew that when the time came, the echo of that justice would be louder than any insult my daughter had ever thrown my way. The first call came 2 days after I left. I recognized the number instantly. My daughter. I let it ring until the sound cut off into silence. A minute later, it rang again. Then again. By the 5th call, I unplugged the cord in my hotel room. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pressed play on the voicemail box. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny. Call me back." Her voice was sharp, annoyed, the same tone she used when she dismissed my stories at the dinner table. I set the phone down without replying. The next day, the messages shifted. "Dad, I went to the bank and they said my name isn't on the account anymore. Did you do something? We need to talk." I sat by the window, sipping bitter hotel coffee, and felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of control. Her panic was not my goal, but it was proof that my silence was working. By the third day, the edge in her voice had softened, replaced with something unfamiliar. Desperation. Please, Dad, don't do this. I didn't mean it that way. You can't just erase me from everything. I'm your daughter. The word daughter cracked in her throat, as if she hoped it still carried weight. But in truth, she had erased that bond long before I did. I remembered the way she told me to shut up, the laughter that followed from her husband, the eyes of my grandchildren looking anywhere but at me. That wasn't a slip of anger. That was truth. And I wasn't about to let a cracked voice on the phone rewrite the reality of what had already been said. The calls didn't stop. They came morning, noon, and night, sometimes 10 in a row. My phone vibrated so often I had to place it in the drawer to muffle the sound. But I never answered. I knew if I picked up, she'd try to twist the narrative, paint herself as the victim, paint me as cruel. No. My silence was my shield, and it was stronger than any argument. I thought of my wife again, how she used to tell me that sometimes the best answer is no answer at all. She had defended me in life, and now in my silence, I was finally learning to defend myself. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. Every time I heard her voice, even in recordings, something inside me ached. A father's instinct doesn't disappear overnight. I wanted to believe she was still the little girl who hugged me tight and whispered, "I missed you, Dad." But the reality was clearer now than it had ever been. The woman calling me wasn't that child anymore. She was someone who believed my presence was disposable until she needed what I provided. And so I stayed silent. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She had taught me at her table that my words didn't matter. Now I was teaching her that my silence could reshape her world. By the fourth day, her messages all carried the same word, heavy and cracked at the edges: daughter. Dad, I'm your daughter. You can't do this to me. Dad, please, we're family. I'm your daughter. You raised me. You gave me everything. Doesn't that mean anything? I'm your daughter? She clung to that word like it was a key to unlock the door she had already slammed shut herself. Each time I replayed her voicemails, I couldn't help but hear the hollowness in it. She wasn't remembering what it meant to be a daughter, she was remembering what she stood to lose. I leaned back in the creaky hotel chair, staring at the photo of my wife on the nightstand. Do you hear her? I whispered to the smiling face frozen in the frame. She remembers she's our daughter only when the bank account stops filling her pockets. I almost expected my wife to answer, to shake her head the way she used to when our girl tested boundaries as a child. But the silence told me enough. The truth was simple: being a daughter isn't just a title. It's a relationship built on respect and love. And she had let that bond rot long before she said those words at the table. Her new pleas didn't erase the contempt in her voice when she told me to shut up. They didn't erase the years of eye rolls, the mocking smirks, the dismissal of every story I shared. That insult had been the final straw, but the cracks had started long before. Her husband began calling too, his messages colder, angrier. He didn't bother with words like family or daughter. He accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of tearing apart the very life I had worked to help them build. I listened to one of his rants late at night, his voice spitting venom through the receiver, and I couldn't help but laugh, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. For years, they treated me like a nuisance, and now that the money had dried up, suddenly, I was the one tearing the family apart. But my silence held firm. I never answered. I never argued. I never explained. Because explanation would give them something to twist, something to use against me. Instead, I let the paperwork speak for me. My lawyer had already filed the changes. My name still stood where it mattered, and theirs had been erased. Each morning I walked to the small diner down the block, nodding at strangers who didn't know my story. They called me sir, poured me coffee, asked if I wanted more toast. To them, I was just another man passing through. But in that anonymity, I felt respected in a way I hadn't in my daughter's house for years. So when her next voicemail cracked again with "Dad, please, I'm your daughter," I turned off the phone and let the silence hang. Because a word without respect is just a sound. And I was done mistaking sounds for love. The storm truly broke a week later. My phone lit up in the middle of the afternoon, her number flashing again and again until I finally let the voicemail pick it up. When I pressed play, her voice was shrill, panicked, almost unrecognizable. "Dad, what is this?" "A realtor just called. Papers came in the mail. The house is listed. You can't sell my house. Do you hear me? You can't. Her house." That's what she called it. As if the ink on those mortgage papers had been hers. As if her signature, not mine, had carried the weight of responsibility. I sat back on the stiff hotel bed, a slow breath filling my lungs, and let her words wash over me. For years, she had spoken as though the house were already hers by right, decorating it, hosting dinners, talking about it like it was her kingdom. And yet every brick, every square foot of land still rested on my name. I couldn't help but marvel at the entitlement. She had forgotten the nights I stayed up worrying whether the payments would clear the years I pinched pennies, so that loan wouldn't crush them the way I put down the deposit from savings I had spent decades building. She saw only the comfort of a roof, not the sacrifices it took to keep it standing. And now she was learning the truth in the harshest way. Her voice cracked again in the next message, raw with desperation. "Dad, stop this. The kids, they need stability. We can't just leave. Please, you can't take this from us." I'll explain what I said. "I'll apologize, just please don't do this." But apologies offered at the edge of loss are not apologies at all. They are bargaining chips, desperation disguised as remorse. If she had valued me, if she had respected me, she would never have silenced me at her table. She would never have laughed off the memories of her mother as if they were clutter. She would never have taught her children that my words were worthless. I pictured the house in my mind, the porch light glowing at dusk, the garden I helped her plant, the living room where my grandchildren sprawled across the rug. It had been a place where I hoped to belong. But now it was a reminder of my humiliation, a stage where I had been stripped of dignity. Selling it wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about removing myself from a place that no longer carried love. Her husband called next, his voice sharp and dripping with fury. "You're out of line, old man. That house is ours. You're going senile if you think you can take it from us." I smiled bitterly as I replayed his words. "Senile," he said. Yet the signatures on those papers proved otherwise. Age had not erased my authority, it had crystallized it. So when I unplugged the phone again that night, I felt no guilt. The house had never been hers. It was mine to give, mine to keep, mine to take away. And now my silence had finally taught her the lesson she refused to hear. Nothing is truly yours unless it is earned with respect. It didn't take long for her husband to step in, and when he did, his voice came like fire through the phone lines. The first voicemail was short-clipped, spoken through clenched teeth. "You're making a mistake, old man. You can't just pull the rug out from under us." The second came later that night, his words louder, more venomous. "Do you realize what you're doing? You're betraying your own family. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." I sat in the dim light of my hotel room, his words rattling through the cheap speaker, and I laughed. Betrayal, the man who smirked when my memory faltered, who sat silently while my daughter told me to shut up, who treated me as a relic cluttering his home. He accused me of betrayal. The irony was almost comical. For years I had been the safety net beneath their marriage. When bills stacked too high, it was my account that balanced them. When the down payment for the house threatened to bury them, it was my savings that lifted them up. Even their car sitting comfortably in the driveway bore my name on the papers, and through all of it, I never asked for thanks. All I wanted was a seat at their table, a place to belong. But belonging had been denied to me the night my daughter silenced me, and that man, her husband, had laughed at my humiliation as though it were a joke. That was betrayal, betrayal of respect, of gratitude, of the very bond that family is supposed to protect. My choice to withdraw what was mine was not betrayal. It was justice. Still, I listened to each of his messages, one after another, the insults piling higher. "You're tearing this family apart. You're a cruel old man. You'll regret this when you're alone." His anger grew with each call, but behind it I heard something else: fear. He had built his comfort on my foundation, and now that foundation was shifting beneath him. The truth was, he had never seen me as family. He had seen me as a resource, a bank account with a fading memory. His respect extended only as far as the next check I signed. So when the check stopped, so did the illusion of kindness. I didn't respond. Not once. Because to respond would be to acknowledge his accusations, to play his game of twisted blame. My silence was my answer, sharper than any defense I could give. The papers had already been signed. The house was already listed. His fury couldn't undo a single signature. As I sat there, I thought of the years I had mistaken compliance for peace. I thought of every time I let their small cuts pass unchallenged. And I realized that what I was doing now wasn't betrayal at all. It was the first honest act of self-respect I had taken in decades. So let him rage, let him spit his venom into the night. His words, like my daughter's insult, would vanish into the air. But my silence, that would remain written in deeds, in accounts, in every corner of the life they once believed, was theirs. Through all the chaos, the calls, the anger, the accusations, there was one absence I couldn't ignore. My grandchildren never called. Not once. Their little voices, once so eager to greet me at the door, were silent now. Perhaps they were too young to understand what was happening. Perhaps their mother and father kept them shielded from the truth. Or perhaps in their small hearts, they had already learned the lesson their mother had been teaching them for years. Grandpa's voice doesn't matter. That thought ached more than the insults, more than the laughter, more than the rage in their father's voicemails. Because children are not born dismissive, they are taught. They mimic what they see, absorb what they hear, and if what they hear is their mother telling me to shut up, then that seed takes root. I had watched it happen at the dinner table, the way they glanced at her, before answering me, the way they giggled when I stumbled over a detail. Those weren't their instincts. Those were habits learned by watching the way I was treated. And yet, as painful as their silence was, I couldn't bring myself to resent them. They were still children caught in the web, spun by their parents' contempt. I thought of them often as I walked the quiet streets near my hotel, my cane tapping against the cracked sidewalks. I wondered if they would remember me as the man who brought puzzles and candy, or as the old man silenced at their table. I prayed it would be the former, but I knew the risk was real, that the disrespect shown to me would one day become their example of how to treat the old, the vulnerable, the ones who had sacrificed for them. That was why my actions mattered more than my words now. I wasn't just reclaiming my dignity for myself. I was teaching even in absence. My silence, my refusal to answer, calls my decision to cut their mother off from what she believed was hers. These were lessons whether they realized it now or not. One day when they are older, they may look back and ask why Grandpa disappeared, why the house was sold, why their mother's voice cracked with desperation on the phone. And perhaps then they will understand that silence has limits, that love without respect is not love at all. I thought of leaving them a letter, something they could read years later. Not a bitter message, but a reminder respect is not optional and gratitude is not weakness. But I stopped myself. No, my silence would be the letter. My absence would be the lesson. I sat by the hotel window one evening, watching the streetlights flicker on, and whispered to the night. One day they'll know. Maybe they would hate me for it. Maybe they would understand. Either way, I had done what I had to do. For myself, for my wife's memory, and in a strange way for them too. Because no child should grow up thinking contempt is normal. The day my lawyer called to confirm everything was finalized, I felt a stillness settle inside me. Not the heavy silence of humiliation, but the calm silence of closure. "It's done," he said. "Her name has been removed from every account. The property is listed. The will is rewritten. She no longer has any legal claim." His tone was matter-of-fact professional, but to me those words were the sound of a door closing and locking behind me. That same afternoon, the phone rang again, and for the first time in days, I listened to her voice without bracing myself. But something was different. Gone was the sharpness, gone was the desperate pleading. What remained was resignation, hollow and flat. "Dad," she said quietly, "I know you did this." I talked to the bank, the lawyer's office, even the realtor. They all say the same thing. It's over, isn't it? There was no rage this time, no cracked insistence that she was my daughter. Just the realization that the ground beneath her feet had shifted for good. I didn't answer, of course. I let her words hang in the air until the voicemail cut off. But as I set the phone down, I felt no triumph. This wasn't about winning or crushing her spirit. It was about ending a cycle that had gone on too long, a cycle of me giving and her taking, of me speaking and her silencing, of me sacrificing and her dismissing. I thought back to that night at the dinner table, the way she snapped shut up as if my memories were trash. The laughter of her husband, the silence of the children. That moment had been the last straw, but the pattern had been building for years, and now, with a handful of signatures, I had cut the pattern off at the root. My lawyer had been efficient. The house would be shown to buyers the following week. The accounts were secure, protected from her reach. My will had been rewritten, not in anger, but in clarity. She was no longer my heir. Instead, the legacy I had worked for would go to causes and people who understood respect. As the sun dipped outside my hotel window, I realized something important. I didn't feel empty anymore. For months, maybe even years, I had carried the weight of hoping for her respect, waiting for her to see me as the father I had been. That weight was gone now. I had stopped waiting. Her resignation in that message wasn't victory. It was simply proof that the truth had reached her. She couldn't shout it away, couldn't laugh it off, couldn't twist it into another humiliation. The papers were final. The silence was unbreakable. That night I lay down on the stiff hotel mattress and slept deeply without the usual ache in my chest. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me dignity. I had given it back to myself. I sat at the small desk in my hotel room, with the stack of finalized documents spread before me, each stamped and signed. Deeds, bank accounts, the will all scrubbed clean of her name. For years, she had spoken of these things as if they were already hers. She decorated the house with the confidence of ownership. She planned family gatherings there as though it had been passed down. She told friends and neighbors that one day it would all be under her roof. And now, in the span of a few weeks, that illusion had vanished. I thought there would be a rush of satisfaction in it, some swell of triumph for finally turning the tables. But there wasn't. Instead, what filled me was a kind of quiet peace, steady and unshakable. This wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about balance. It was about dignity. She had stripped me of mine at that table, and now I had simply reminded her that respect is not optional, that it is the foundation of every inheritance, every bond, every memory that holds a family together. The irony was heavy. She believed her words could erase me, but it was my silence that erased her. She thought laughter could reduce me, but it was my decisions that reduced her claims to dust. She thought time and habit had made me powerless, but all along, power rested quietly in my name, waiting for me to remember it. I imagined her voice when she discovered the house was no longer hers to control the accounts, no longer available, the will rewritten without her in it. The calls I ignored already told me part of the story, first annoyance, then panic, then desperation, and now resignation. Each stage was a mirror of what she had put me through, dismissing me, mocking me, ignoring me, until finally realizing too late that I had slipped away. But even as I thought of her, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt distance. The years of sacrifice, the skipped meals, the long hours bent over machines, the nights awake with worry, they had all been gifts I gave freely. I could never take those back. What I could take back was my dignity, and that was exactly what I had done. I leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath, looking at the photograph of my wife propped against the lamp. "It's done," I whispered to her. "She won't use my name to silence me again." In her smile, frozen in time, I almost saw approval, as if she knew this moment would come, as if she had been waiting for me to stand tall again. And so no, I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply breathed easier the way a man does when a heavy weight has finally been lifted off his chest. She had lost everything she thought was hers, but what I had gained was far greater peace. When the last of the papers were signed and the lawyer assured me everything was finished, I packed my suitcase once more. Not with urgency this time, but with care. I had no intention of returning to my daughter's house, no desire to linger in the hotel where the air smelled of dust and loneliness. I needed somewhere that felt like mine, somewhere quiet, but not the suffocating quiet of humiliation. A silence of my own choosing. I drove west until the roads grew narrower and the trees taller, their branches arching overhead like old guardians. Eventually, I found a small cabin tucked against the slope of a mountain, surrounded by pines that swayed in the wind. The roof sagged a little. The porch creaked under my steps. But the moment I turned the key in the lock, I felt more at home than I had in years. Inside, the rooms were bare. A wood stove stood in the corner. The walls carried the faint scent of cedar, and the windows looked out onto endless green. I placed my suitcase on the floor, set my wife's photo on the mantel, and for the first time since leaving my daughter's table, I felt the ache in my chest ease. In the mornings, I rose with the sun-brewed coffee slowly and carried my mug to the porch. The air was crisp, untouched, filled with the sound of birds instead of harsh voices. The silence here was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't cruel. It was steady cleansing, like a balm over old wounds. I walked the dirt paths with my cane nodding at the few neighbors I passed. To them, I was just another old man enjoying fresh air. They didn't know my story, didn't know what I had left behind. And that anonymity was a gift. I didn't need to defend myself, didn't need to prove my worth. Out here, I was enough, just as I was. At night, I sat by the fire reading books I had never had time for, letting the crackle of flames replace the memory of laughter that wasn't meant for me. Sometimes I spoke softly to the photograph of my wife, telling her about my walks, about the way the mountains glowed gold in the evening light. In those moments, I could almost feel her beside me, nodding, smiling, as though she approved of the peace I had finally found. This silence was not the silence my daughter forced upon me at her table. That silence was humiliation, a stripping away of dignity. This silence was different, it was chosen, and therefore it was powerful. It reminded me that my worth had never depended on her approval, her tone, or her laughter. My worth was built into every brick I laid, every hour I worked, every sacrifice I made. And here in this cabin among the trees, I could finally live without waiting for someone else to remember that truth. My silence was no longer my prison. It had become my freedom. The cabin gave me space to breathe, but it also gave me space to think. For years, I had assumed that everything I built, every dollar, saved, every piece of property, every account, would one day pass to my daughter. It seemed natural. Parents give to their children. That's the rhythm of life. But what happens when a child treats that gift like entitlement, when respect is replaced with contempt? That question gnawed at me until I knew the answer. My legacy had to go somewhere. It would be valued. One morning I spread my papers out on the wooden table by the window, the same way I had in my hotel room weeks earlier. Only now, instead of feeling the sting of humiliation, I felt the clarity of purpose. I wrote down names, causes, organizations I had admired over the years, but never thought to support directly. A local children's charity that gave warm meals and books to kids in need. A foundation that funded scholarships for students whose parents couldn't afford tuition. A shelter for veterans who had fallen on hard times. People who, unlike my own blood, would understand what sacrifice meant. My lawyer didn't blink when I called him again. I want everything redirected, I told him. When my time comes, nothing goes to her. It all goes to these causes. His voice was steady, respectful. Understood, he said. I'll make it happen. I closed my eyes after hanging up, picturing the faces of children sitting down to a hot meal, students walking proudly across a stage with diplomas in hand, veterans finding safety and dignity in a warm bed. That image gave me more comfort than the thought of my daughter adding another room to her house ever could. My sacrifices, once dismissed as clutter, would instead become stepping stones for those who needed them most. It struck me as ironic she had mocked my stories, rolled her eyes at my memories, but now my story would live on in strangers who would never know my name. And somehow, that felt right. Legacy is not about blood alone. Legacy is about honor, gratitude, and the values you leave behind. My daughter had chosen to sever herself from that. I was only making it official. In the evenings, as I sat by the fire, I no longer thought of what she had taken from me. I thought instead of what I was giving back to the world. My silence, once heavy, had become an instrument of justice. By erasing her from my will, I wasn't punishing her. I was simply refusing to reward contempt. I lifted the photo of my wife from the mantel, held it close, and whispered, "We didn't live our lives just to be forgotten. What we built will live on, just not in the way she expected." Her smile, frozen in that photograph, seemed to glow brighter in the firelight. For the first time in years, I felt proud not of what I had given up, but of what I was choosing to leave behind. I sometimes sit on the porch of my cabin at dusk, leaning against the railing, watching the sun disappear behind the ridge. The world turns quiet then, only the rustle of pine needles and the cry of a distant bird. And in that quiet, I hear her words again, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." They used to cut me like a knife. Now they feel like an echo from another lifetime, one that no longer has power over me. She thought those words would silence me forever, and in a way they did. But not as she expected. Her command became the moment I stopped wasting breath on a table where I was no longer welcome. I did shut up, but on my own terms. I withdrew my words, my presence, my support, and finally my legacy. And in that silence, I found strength greater than any speech could give me. I remember how she and her husband laughed, how my grandchildren avoided my eyes, how I sat there with my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. That humiliation once made me feel small, invisible. But what I've come to realize is that silence, when chosen, is not humiliation. It's power. The power to step away, to reclaim what is mine, to stop begging for respect that should never have required begging in the first place. When the final papers were signed, when her calls went unanswered, when she realized her safety net had vanished, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt free. Free from the weight of hoping for her approval. Free from the ache of waiting for gratitude that never came. Free from the burden of pretending that love without respect is still love. Here in these mountains, my silence has a different sound. It is the crackle of firewood, the whistle of the wind through the trees, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I don't need to raise my voice to be heard. I don't need to remind anyone of the sacrifices I made. The life I built speaks for itself, and it speaks loudest in the way I chose to walk away. Sometimes I wonder if she sits at that same dinner table now, the seat where I once sat empty beside her. I wonder if she feels the weight of my absence, if she tells herself the story differently. But then I remind myself it no longer matters. I didn't leave for her to learn. I left for me to live. So yes, she told me to shut up. And I did. I shut up, stood up, and walked out the door with my dignity intact. And in that silence, I took back everything she thought was hers. My silence is no longer a prison, it is my victory. As I sit in this quiet cabin, I realize that my story is not just about a father and a daughter. It's about dignity, about the moment we must all decide whether to keep enduring disrespect or finally choose ourselves. My daughter told me to shut up, and in that moment she believed she had reduced me to nothing. But what she didn't understand was this silence forced on you is humiliation. But silence chosen on your own terms is strength. I spent decades sacrificing for her, building her comfort with my labor, believing that love alone would be enough to secure respect. I was wrong. Love without respect is not love, it's exploitation. And no parent, no matter how much they give, should accept contempt as the return on their devotion. So I ask you, those listening to my story, now, have you ever faced a moment when your own family dismissed you, mocked you, or treated you as though your worth had expired? Did you endure it, or did you finally decide to walk away? What did that silence mean to you? If this story resonates with you, please share your own experiences in the comments. Let others learn from your journey. And if you believe in the lesson I've shared, that dignity is worth more than inheritance, then like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you for listening.